Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
And that voice you can hear is Mr. Ben Dobson. Oh, by the way, guys, welcome to Book Corner Extra Time. Ben is on this episode to talk about his wonderful book, Too Good to Be Forgotten. I almost break out in song to the Shy Lights there, but I'm going to leave that for the Shy Lights. And I think Amazulu covered it as well.
Amazulu was definitely the version I was thinking about when that title popped into my head.
Firstly, before we get talking about Too Good to Be Forgotten, tell me about Ben Dobson. Where does Ben come from? And your back catalogue, and you've got a great pedigree in sports, haven't you?
Oh, well, yeah, I ended up living the dream. I don't know what I did to deserve it, but yeah, I spent 25 years, Paul, working for Adidas, and for the last 10 years of those, I landed on my feet looking after our cricket and rugby divisions, and yeah, basically got into all sorts of places. I probably my own sporting prowess should never have allowed me anywhere near, and to a load of people who otherwise would have remained distant heroes, and never took that for granted. It was absolutely fantastic. But when I came to leave there, I'd always had books in my head, and when I left Adidas at the end of COVID, a combination of lockdown and garden leave at the same time, my wife took one look at me and said, "You haven't got an excuse not to write that anymore, have you?" So that was it. I was, I had a gun to my head from that point. But yeah, I've been very lucky. If somebody had told me when I was 7 years old, the first time I turned up in the Milton Road car park at the Dell, that I'd spend my life in sport, I'd have bitten their hands off.
So you grew up being a Southampton fan, a Southampton season ticket holder. The Dell was your home, and then you moved to St Mary's. Where did you prefer, the Dell or St Mary's? I love the
Well,
character of the Dell.
I'll let you into a secret here that although I have been to St Mary's on one of my relatively few visits back down south now, because I'm currently resident up in the Peak District, I've never actually set foot inside it, and that's not a statement that I'm trying to make there, but it is in some way linked to the what I consider to be the romantic nature of the book. Maybe some would call it nostalgic rather than romantic. The Dell was my youth, and that's what I grew up with. That was the soul of the club that I know and love. And it was partly circumstance that had taken me to the north of England with Adidas, and partly the fact that I was working on weekends in other sports. But I've never actually set foot inside the stadium. And I do actually have, the book as total concentrates on three clubs at the time in Forest, Ipswich, and Southampton. And I do have a degree of envy, I suppose, for those Ipswich fans. I definitely feel a certain kinship with them. But the fact that there's going to be a game in 10 days' time, which we hope will be a promotion six-pointer at Portman Road between Ipswich and Saints, that's going to be at what I would consider to be still a proper football ground in Portman Road. We knew that we had to move on from the Dell if we wanted to compete in the modern world, but it still has a large part of my heart, and so I will make my debut at St Mary's one day, but I've not been in there yet. So the Dell is my place.
Fantastic. And you did reference those three fantastic football clubs, and they were managed because football clubs back in those days pretty much had a manager for maybe a decade or more My team, Birmingham City, have had 6 managers this season, and we're not yet at Easter. It was a different game back then. It was still the same rules. You still try and score goals. There's still 11 aside. But yeah, the nostalgia, the romance was all there in abundance. Mr. Clough went into Nottingham Forest when they were really in the basements of what now is the Championship. Mr. Robson had left Fulham, or as Malcolm would say, really forced out of Fulham. That is the great Super Malcolm MacDonald. And Lawrie was there at Saints. Think he was manager at, or he certainly got something to do with Doncaster Rovers, hadn't he? But he was a former Coldstream guard, wasn't he, Lawrie?
He was indeed, and the thing that people maybe forget, it's funny that you referenced the Birmingham having the 6 managers. Both Bobby and Lawrie had serious tough times when they first arrived at the respective clubs. Both had come off the back of sackings in lower divisions. Both were seen by fans at the time as slightly underwhelming appointments, and both of them had a lot to try and turn around when they got there, including some player power in the dressing room, which forms an interesting part of the story. But what they both reference is what they called their old world board of directors that supported them. And I think it was John Cobbold, the unbelievable old Etonian who was in charge at Ipswich, who at the time people were calling for his head, said of Bobby that our manager's name is not written on a chalkboard with a wet sponge hanging next to it. And both Bobby and Lawrie, Saints fans and Ipswich fans, will have to accept the fact that that some of their ilk back in the day were calling for their heads before the good days came along, and the boards that they had that supported them. Lawrie made quite an interesting point to me when kindly agreed to write the foreword to the book. But he said, I had this group of old world directors at Southampton who were true gentlemen, but the difference between then and now is that they were rich people, they were successful people, they had enough money to support the club, but they were local business people who gave something to the community and were part of that community. Whereas these days, Lawrie says, all I hear is the word owners.
Yeah.
There were no owners in our day. There was a board of directors and there was a community. And that was very interesting.
Every club had people like that on board. And I remember doing a podcast with Paul Fletcher, and he was telling me about the infamous Bob Lord at Burnley. You would have
Yes.
someone in a town or a city that did good, invested their money into the club that they loved. It wasn't just their club, it was our club. Why did you pick those 3 managers, or was it the 3 clubs that you wanted to? How did you formulate the 3, not 4, not 2, but come to that magic number of 3? And will there be a follow up to Too Good to Be Forgotten?
Well, there were a couple of ways in which I came to it. The first was that my first book, Chasing Rainbows, I'd written a couple of years earlier, and that was a bit of a nostalgic take on the purgatory of being an English sports fan, and how over 47 years of following England in various sports and Southampton and etc., I probably had about 6 moments of true elation.
Yeah.
But being a terrible old nostalgist, as anybody that listens to this or reads the book will soon pick up on, it took me back to that era when I grew up with Lawrie. My years being a season ticket holder at Southampton basically bookended Lawrie's, and therefore I'm eternally grateful to Lawrie for being as responsible as anybody for the happiness of my childhood. But it took me back to that era, and it took me back to an era when, with my club now in the Championship, I was thinking about those days when provincial clubs like ours, um, unfashionable clubs, could actually, with the right management, the right ambition, they could achieve special things in a way that, unfortunately, without being too melancholy about it, is not going to happen again.
No.
At the same time, I read a book by Leo Moynihan and Johnny Owen called The Three Kings, which I'm sure you'll be aware of.
Yeah, I
Um,
interviewed both of them for it.
yeah, yeah, really enjoyed it. And that was all about Busby, Shankly, and Steen, and the fact that these guys came from within 30 miles of each other in Glasgow. And I suddenly thought, when I thought about Lawrie, I thought there's a parallel here. Who were the clubs that broke the mold at that time, 75 to 85? And it was Ipswich, it was Forest, it was Saints. And they had three managers who were all, the more I looked into it, the more strange synergies there were, that they were all born within 3 years of each other, within 40 miles of each other in the hotbed that is in the northeast of England.
Yeah.
And the upbringings they had in the austere 1930s, the pre-war years, and the family and the values that came with that sort of northeastern upbringing, that never left them. And it became part of their management, part of what people called their genius of management of men. And the more I looked at it, the more beautiful little comparisons there were. So that's where it started from, even to the point, although the book is not meant to be about the results as such, it's more about what happened to the communities. But if you take a look, I think I mentioned it in the book, that if you take a look at the respective records of those managers at those three specific clubs, they are incredibly preposterously similar, and that's why I think Paul, also, that at the back end of the book I make an author's note to say, look, I get Watford and I get Graham Taylor, and they were marvellous for a period in this time. When I say that it can't happen again, people may say Leicester City. I'll say to them, that's great, and it was one of the greatest sporting miracles of our time. If you want to wait for the next 5,000 to 1 outsider to win the Premier League, you'll be waiting a long time. But also the fact that what happened with these guys, it was the longevity of it. And Leicester City, bless them, within 18 months of winning that title, although they've had success since, N'Golo Kante, Riyad Mahrez, Ben Chilwell, Danny Drinkwater, Harry Maguire, all gone to bigger, supposedly bigger clubs. And that's the nature of the world these days. And I also, and I hate to mention the name in front of you, Paul, but I also recognise in that author's note, Aston Villa,
Genius.
in this period. Obviously, Ron Saunders was at Birmingham for a time as well. And I'm in no way, the book is not meant to ignore the achievements of those people from just off the A38 in winning a league title and a European Cup. But it didn't quite fit the narrative that I had of these three guys coming from the Northeast, being very, very personally close, particularly McMenemy and Robson and Clough, sorry. And what they did with those three clubs over a period of, it was 10 years, really, which won't happen again.
And all built clubs. Now, let's go back to the 70s. Managers were given a little bit of money. You could go back to 60s and before that as well. Given a little bit of money by the board of directors to build sides, were given time, even up to the 90s with Sir Alex Ferguson, given time. Now, managers aren't given time. But when you look at Bobby Robson in particular, went on internationally and managed England at World Cups, and also managed in foreign lands and spoke their languages. And Robson was one of those that has always been touted. I do hear that the Gareth Southgate's the most successful English manager since Ramsey, I don't subscribe to that because it's one bugger all. We haven't really been successful. I mean, if you're looking at successful, football was littered with successful
I,
managers
I
back in the
don't.
70s.
I don't like to be too disrespectful, and I hope that he rams this down my throat with the Euros coming up. But I can't remember who it was that I heard say the other day that for all the semi-finals and the finals that have come up recently, there is still a feeling in some that that the England team is a Ferrari in the hands of a coach driver.
Yeah.
Yeah, that some people will disagree, but I understand where that person was coming from.
Well, Alan Hudson coined the name Safegate many years ago when we done, I think it was our World Cup diaries or the Euro diaries. Terry Curran, of course, my other podcast partner,
Yeah,
played for 2 out of those 3 managers. He didn't play for Bobby Robson, but he certainly played for Browne, and he
yeah,
certainly played for Lawrie. And that 70s period, we had so many, almost what you were saying, and it wasn't the haves and the have-nots. It was more provincial versus capital,
mm,
or big city clubs. I've wrote down here a few that could have won the league in the 70s. Sheffield United, Stoke City, Ipswich, Villa. Okay, Villa are from Birmingham, QPR are from London, Wolverhampton Wanderers, Forest, Derby, Newcastle, and then others: Leeds United, Man City, Man United, Everton, Liverpool, Spurs, Arsenal. That's pretty much the whole of the first division that
yeah,
always had a chance of winning either a League Cup, an FA Cup, or the League Championship in old
yeah.
money. That was just a fabulous decade, the 70s.
Absolutely. And as I say, with one of the messages or takeouts of the book really is that, and one of the reasons I wrote it was that too good to be forgotten comes from the fact that I feel a slight sadness that that won't happen again.
Yeah.
It simply won't. Um, as a Saints fan, and I don't want to lose my copyright, but there may be another book in this that the more people I talk to, whether they're Burnley fans this season or Norwich City fans for the past few seasons, um, I I have a feeling. Of course, you want your own side to be as successful as possible. There's a small part of me that would love Saints to finish at the top of the championship this year, win the title, and then be the first side to ever politely decline the invitation to join the elite. Because when you look at
Mm.
there's an element of a fool's paradise to that place for clubs like ours and Ipswich's now. Um, Ipswich will have a whale of a time if and when they go up because they haven't been there for a while and everybody wants to go to Old Trafford and that sort of thing. That's fine. But as a Saints fan, that when you've spent 5 to 10 years battling for that 38 points every season, and that is the limit of your ambitions, it becomes very wearing. And when you go back down into the championship, the sense of community that I talk about in the book has come back to the club this season. From that division, you start at the beginning of the season, you have no idea whether you're going to finish bottom or you're going to finish top, and that can't happen in the top division anymore. And if you actually look at the division as it is at the moment, it reads like a who's who of those sorts of clubs that you were just referencing there, Paul, in that provincial, whether it's a big city or whether it's a more provincial town or city, it's those clubs that I believe English football is all about. And you've got an Ipswich and a Norwich, Leicester and a Leeds and a Southampton, but you've got Coventry in there, and you've got Sheffield Wednesday, and you've got Sunderland, and you've got Stoke City, and just every week there is a game that stirs the memories. And sometimes I feel like there's a few fans out there now that need to be careful what they wish for. That a year in the Premier League's quite fun. 5 years is not so much fun, and that's a problem for the game.
Absolutely. And another thing that Brian Howard Clough did was the last football manager to take a team up from the second division and win it in the first season,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then went on and won double European Cups. So
Mm.
Clough and Nottingham Forest have won the European Cup more times than they've actually won the Football League Championship. But again, in the olden days, when you got into Europe, there was three cups like there is today. But you had to win your league, you had to win your cup, or finish in the top six. Very, very different days. But again, that achievement from Forest and Clough, that will never be forgotten as well.
No, absolutely. I think I quote Viv Anderson in the book saying that what he did there, um, uh, coming up and winning it straight off the bat, will never happen again.
Hmm.
And it's very dangerous to say never, but we all know what he means,
Yeah.
because there is a glass ceiling there now, and everybody's definition of success at a club like my own, and even at clubs like Forest and Ipswich, the definition of success has been altered, which is a shame, because someone is artificially putting a limit on your ambitions, which yes, it is a shame. But when you look at what I think, it was one of my favorite writers on sport and everything else, Duncan Hamilton. He referred to Forest when Cloughy turned up as a rusting tugboat of a club, and that's pretty much what it was. And funnily enough, the reason I start the book with this element of sliding doors, there's three games that I refer to that all happened within a very short period of time, each in very unremarkable settings, unremarkable it seemed games at the time. Um, but they were games that were on a knife edge, and if they'd flipped the other way at the vital moment, this story may very well not have happened. And people forget the fact that although Cloughy performed his miracle at Nottingham Forest, it didn't happen straight away. After 18 months, Cloughy was not really any more dramatically successful than Robson and McMenemy had been in their first 18 months at their clubs. Um, and we came to the final game of the second division, as was in 1977. And Forest, as befits Cloughy, having finished their season, not being able to do anything else about it, were on the plane to Calamajor, Milor in Mallorca. Brian, Peter Taylor, and their squad, leaving Bolton and Wolves to play out a game that, had Bolton got even a point from it, they would have been the firm favourites to take the third promotion spot, and Forest wouldn't have gone up. And you can still YouTube it. In the last minute of that game, Bolton had about three opportunities in the 6-yard box, which they didn't take. Wolves won the game 1-0. In that moment, Forest were promoted, and Tony Woodcock said to me when I talked to him for the book, he said, everything changed in that moment. And it wasn't us. Somebody else had done it for us. But everything changed in that moment. We were able to go and strengthen. We bought Shilton, Gebel, Burns. And without that, things would have been very different. It's not to say with a manager of Clough's genius that things wouldn't have happened for Forest, but it's a fact that if Bolton had not gone up that season, if they'd scored one of those goals against Wolves, then they would not have won a title in '78, and they would not have won 2 European Cups in the subsequent years. So sometimes, fate takes a hand. But there's an American author called Marissa Mayer, who I quote in the book, as saying, and I like this quote, that says, maybe there's not such a thing as fate. Maybe it's the opportunities we're given and what we do with them. And to me, that sums up those three managers. The sliding doors may have opened for Cloughy, but he burst right through them.
I think even if they were slightly ajar, Clough would have just gone through them like Billy the Kid, like Stan Bowles used to at 5 minutes to 3 into the Loftus Road dressing room. Right, who we playing? Get me boots on, get me kit on, let's go. Wolverhampton Wanderers that day in May. Neil Watmore scored against them and had a goal disallowed. It was that touch and go. Bobby Gould played in goal, didn't they? They had to put Bobby in goal, and also the goal that Kenny Hibbett scored. I did ask Ken if Brian Clough had sent him a crate of champagne, and he said no, that he didn't, because in Clough's way, they got promoted themselves, not by what Wolverhampton Wanderers done. But
No,
Gerald Sinstant on commentary said of the free kick, a well-rehearsed free kick. It wasn't. Kenny Hibbett inadvertently put his studs on the ball that made the ball live. Willie Carr then literally had to improvise and went to play the ball and just jockeyed off a little bit as the players of Bolton come towards him. He then flicked it up, chipped it up, and Kenny had a volley that just about nestled in by the goal post. But again, me and Alan do a podcast, My Life, My Music, and we always touch upon those if only moments. Some people call them sliding doors. You can also call them if only. If
yes,
only that ball didn't go in the net. You're absolutely right. They'd have still gone to Mallorca. Terry Curran was on the plane that
yeah,
day as well, and they'd
yeah,
have probably just had a jolly up and prepared for life
yeah.
in the second division for next season. But
Well, the one of the synchronicities as I looked into this, it was remarkable how many synchronicities there were between the three managers and the three clubs, and the way the story developed. Um, there were similar moments all within 24 months of each other. So that was May 77, as you say. In January 1976, I was sat in the stands at Southampton, my first ever FA Cup game at the Dell, and Saints were going out to Villa at about 3 minutes to 4:45, in a fairly unremarkable way. And I think I say in the book that there was no sense of sort of violent disapproval, more one of resignation from the Saints fans that they'd gone out in the same way in the third round the year before. And here they were 1-0 down to a first division team. And then Hughie Fisher, of all people, one of the nicest men ever to pull on a Saints shirt, but also definitely one of Laurie's road sweepers rather than his violinists, tucked one in from about 25 yards past John Burry in injury time. And what was it? Something like 28 weeks later, Southampton were lifting the FA Cup. And similarly, in the year that Robson won the FA Cup with Ipswich, people forget that for all the fact that he'd built a side at Ipswich in the first half of the 70s, which were, I think they finished in the top 6 9 years out of 10.
Yeah.
But he hadn't had any significant success, and Bobby wasn't happy with that. And he'd been there by the time they won the cup in 78. He'd been there 9 years. And he needed something. And what people will forget, I remembered obviously the Saints game. I also remembered the circumstances of Forest. Until I researched the book, I'd forgotten about the fact that, and it's still there on HTV, I think, somewhere on YouTube, that Ipswich in that cup run played an away game at Bristol Rovers in the fifth round. They were 2-1 down, not too long to go. Bobby Gould, who you previously mentioned, was playing for Rovers, and was put through and tucked the ball in the net, and the linesman erroneously put his flag up for offside, not realising that the ball had been played back off an Ipswich defender. And in injury time, Robin Turner, who'd never scored for Ipswich in his life before, managed to skew the ball onto the inside of a post, which then trickled over the line for a 2-2 draw. and again 3 rounds later, Bobby's lifting the FA Cup, and these things are incredible moments. It's not meant to in any way decry what these managers achieve, but I think what it does show is that every one of us needs we need a little bit of good fortune on our side if you're going to achieve sustained success.
There's a wonderful book called The Cup, written by Richard Whitehead, who's an Aston Villa supporter. And I asked him, why did you call it The Cup and not the FA Cup? And he said, I remember as a kid going to Villa Park in a replay against Southampton in 1976. And
Oh, Jim McCallion.
my dad said, whoever beats the Villa wins the cup. Southampton did that year. I mean,
Yeah.
Jimmy Mack, what a player. The Bobby Stokes obviously scored the goal, but what a fantastic drop ball with backspin for Bobby Stokes. I asked Jim what was his better pass, to Bobby Stokes or to Mick Shannon in the first half, and he did say that they were both brilliant, but Mick wasn't as great a finisher as Bobby.
Well, yeah, and I mean, Jim was definitely one of Laurie's rascals, and there's a chapter in the book called Rascals and Villains, and that's no reference to Aston Villa in that case, but it was the fact that by their sheer power of personality, these guys weren't afraid of taking on the rough diamonds that other people were a little bit wary of.
Yeah.
And through honesty, trust, respect, getting something out of these guys that other people couldn't. And I remember I went down to chat. It was quite a surreal experience for me because he'd been, when I was 8 years old, this man had been the chap that had picked up the FA Cup for my side when I was 8 years old, Peter Rodrigues, the last man, incidentally, to pick it up from Her Majesty the Queen. But I went to see Peter, and Peter still lives in a suburb of Southampton, which is another strand to the story. And Peter said, "Look, when I finished, we were talking about Laurie's ability to manage those Stardust players, and he said, when I finished, I had a pub called the King Roofers, and we had a big picture behind the bar of the 76 Cup winning team. And I used to walk past that picture and look at it and think, how the hell did he manage that up?" But this was their supreme ability to be able to handle players of that ilk. And as I think Peter Osgood once said, who was one of his greatest success stories in that regard, he could take us old lags and he could squeeze the pips and get that bit of extra out of us. And that's a fascinating part of the tale, to be honest.
And also, Oz was supposed to be joining Uddy and going to Stoke, but he did want to go and have a word with Lawrie, and clearly Lawrie and Mick Shannon and the boys persuaded the big man to join him there at the Dell rather than join Uddy at the Potteries.
I think there were maybe two reasons. One was the fact that Ozzy suddenly realised that if he went down there and got together with the likes of Mick and Brian O'Neill, then there would be some regular trips to Ascot and Newbury and Windsor, which I think played a certain part in the way that Lawrie also brought the likes of Alan Ball and Kevin Keegan into the club. The other element I think for somebody like Ozzy was, and all three managers did this again. As I looked into it, I realised that it was another shared trait and characteristic, that if they'd identified the guy that they wanted, they would not let him go. And this was the day long before agents and directors of football and this, that, and the other. And Lawrie simply, Ozzy told a story of Lawrie coming around to see him. He went round to Laurie's house, and as he came in, he was slightly surprised to see Lawrie locking the front door after him. And he basically said, "You're not leaving this house until you sign for Southampton." And I think joking aside, he did the same thing with Borley, and it made an impression on these guys that, if he wants me that much, this is a place I need to come.
Yeah.
And Lawrie had this incredible bearing and personality about him that people maybe underplay. I was very conscious when I started the book that there's a lot of books out there about Cloughy, plenty out there about Sir Bobby. It's why I wanted to write it from a slightly different perspective, which I hope I've done. But I may be biased, but I felt that not enough maybe had been written about Lawrie, and that actually uh, what he achieved, it may not have been the same number of trophies, but the sorts of things he achieved were every bit as impressive as his mates.
But he didn't just, well, he did play in two cup finals, didn't he? Well, he didn't play, he managed in two cup finals, League Cup in 79 and of course in 1976. And as
Yeah.
it is in Jim McCalliog's autobiography, Wembley Win, Wembley Woes, the second one was a woe. But there was a garden in Eastleigh, I believe it is, where Terry used to live, that had got
Okay.
a piece of Wembley turf in the that it's pretty much like stuck into his grass. I do believe Terry took it with him when he went back up north, but it was there for a certain time in
Yeah.
Southampton because Alan Ball said to Terry, "You might not play again at Wembley TC." So you had tankards in those days. So
Yes.
Bawley got a lump of turf from Wembley, stuck it in Terry Curran's tankard, and he put that in his grass when he got home.
Yeah. But the other thing, Paul, was that the cups in those days um, were significant. I mean, one of the reasons that these three guys have this connection to the community and are revered in the way they are, it was one of the fans that I talked to, because the book involves conversations with a number of fans, because it was supposed to be just about them and what it meant to them, what these managers did for the towns and the communities, as it was the results. Um, but yeah, one of those fans actually said to me, it was because they did things first, and nobody else is ever going to be able to win Forest's first title, or Southampton's first FA Cup, or
Yeah.
Ipswich's first FA Cup. And actually, John Walk said to me, he said, I know that Bobby prefers the UEFA Cup because it was Europe and that sort of thing, but for me, my best ever trophy will be the FA Cup because it was the first thing. And that's quite significant. Plus the fact that if you go back to the year that my team won it in '76, even in '78 when Ipswich won it, it would be hard to explain to a generation now if they weren't there. But you ask any fan in 1976 or '78 whether they'd prefer to win the league title or the FA Cup, it was no contest. The FA Cup, with a little nod to the European Cup, I suppose, the FA Cup was, and the FA Cup final was the single biggest global club game that you could get. And people don't realize that now, and that's why it was so special. And when you have 200,000 people crammed into Ipswich Town Centre or Southampton Civic Centre to welcome these teams home, that's massive, and it doesn't leave people. It's still, there is still a love in the city of Southampton for those days as a result.
You're absolutely right because the FA Cup was the it was the greatest day in the football calendar. Okay, we didn't have live TV games like we have today. It was the FA Cup final. You would turn up, or you would have members of your family turn up. You'd have the bumper cans of ale in the front room. Everybody would be crowded around the television set. It was, it was like you got the Grand National, like you got the England Scotland. The FA Cup was the biggest sporting occasion in the calendar, and
Mm.
of course, we followed the teams throughout their journey. literally on Grandstand or on World of Sport.
Hmm.
They'd have a comedian on the coach. They'd have players' wives. They'd have different games. They might play FA Cup final. It's a knockout. It was a TV spectacle for us kids that remember watching that. Just as much as in the school holidays, Champion the Wonder Horse and Skippy and programs like that.
I mean, we're going to get put in jail for our level of nostalgia soon, I think. But I don't really apologise for it. Hence the title of the book. But yeah, they were very, very special days.
And of course, the John O'Hare story in 1978 when Nottingham Forest beat Liverpool in the replay. I think it was at Old Trafford, wasn't it? Got an idea. John McGovern didn't play in that game, but John O'Hare was tripped outside the box by Tomo, and the
Yes.
referee gave a penalty. And Peter Taylor's answer, I thought, was one of the greatest bits of TV that I've ever seen. It wasn't a penalty. Well, it was. Well, we'll show you. Have a look. It was outside the box. You have a look in the paper. It says 1-0. It's a penalty. It's
Yeah.
just brilliant. I mean, Clough and Taylor, what a double act they were. And really, one of them on their own, it wasn't the same. When
No.
they both got
No.
together, the magic happened.
It says in the book actually that Tony Woodcock always said that John McGovern said to him that together they were special. Individually they were good.
Yeah.
Together they were unbeatable.
Yeah.
And the building of very good support staffs is also part of the skill. It was one of the ingredients in the recipe for success, and it was common to all three as well. Peter Taylor is the fated one, but Lawrie had Jim Clooney, Bobby in particular. When I talked to the Ipswich players at the time, they said that Ron Gray, the head of the scouting team, and Cyril Lee, who was Bobby's right-hand man, played every bit as much of a part. And I remember Brian Hamilton, who was obviously with Bobby, in Bobby's first really strong team. He said that he felt that Ron Gray was critical to the success as the chief scout because he was the eyes and ears. And if you look, Ipswich did it slightly differently in that the players that they brought in through Ron Gray, if you're a guy who's brought to the club George Burley, John Walk, Kevin Beattie, etc., Alan Brazil, then you're doing something right. And having that support staff is a management skill in itself, putting the right people in place. My favourite Cloughieism that I hadn't heard before, it's probably as old as the houses, but I hadn't heard it before until I was delving into the research for the book, was that I was looking into these guys' genius for man management that got referenced a lot, and people were talking about, Rodney Hogg, the Australian fast bowler's description of Mike Brearley, the England captain, as the bloke with a degree in people, and it was of that ilk, and I'm thinking, okay, I found out that somebody had once asked Cloughie how important psychology was in football management, and he said, "Well, you go and ask Sigmund Freud how many European Cups he's won," which I thought was a classic Cloughieism.
I mean, Cloughie was just the king of the. Well, he's a quote king, wasn't he?
Well, yeah,
I mean, he was on every TV program back in the 70s as well. He was probably more of a maverick than the Mavericks.
No, absolutely. And I mean, the other thing that came up in the book is this distinction between a lot of people referred to this genius for man management, and I was interested to know whether these guys would have bridled at the fact that people were suggesting they were man managers rather than coaches, because they could coach, they just coached in a very different way. But Cloughie's take on coaching was what was the famous one when he said to a journalist once, "Me telling Roy McFarlane to get his hair cut." Now that's top quality coaching. But it's an interesting area, the coaching versus man management. Because I remember
Forrest hardly trained.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, Russell Osmond told me a couple of tales about Bobby at Ipswich, which kind of related to these things. The first one was simply to say, look, we didn't do a lot of. I asked him whether Bobby did much in terms of tactics versus the opposition, studying the opposition, because I knew darn well that Clough didn't. And he said, well, no, he didn't. We kept it simple. We believed that if we passed a player with the same coloured shirts on, if we were on our day, we could beat anybody. He said there was another reason with Bobby, and he said the problem was that we know that Bobby used to have a few problems with names, and he said he always used to call Emlyn Hughes was always Elwyn. And the Watford striker was always Luther Lissett, and he said, so funnily enough, we didn't do a lot on the opposition for fear of dying of laughter. But he did also make a more serious point when he said, in terms of coaching and management, Bobby didn't do, none of these three did a lot of what you would call technical coaching to try and improve players technically. Yeah. What they did was they took a player. They didn't worry so much about their weaknesses. Somebody else could cover those. They put them into a role in the team which would exacerbate their strengths and make the team stronger. But they would do things subtly. So Russell said that he'd been playing in the first team for a while, and Bobby came to him and said, why can't you play a bit more like Bobby Moore? And he said, well, easier said than done, I thought. And he said, well, what do you mean? And he said, you're forever charging around and flying into tackles when actually just go and have a look at Bobby Moore. And he said a couple of weeks later, we went away and we played at Manchester City. And I barely broke sweat all game. I think we won. And I came I came into the dressing room and I thought I was in for a rollicking. There was barely a bead of sweat on me. And he said, now, that's how to play. And he said, but I didn't do anything. And he said, it was because you didn't have to do anything. You read the game, you intercepted the ball, you didn't make a tackle. And he said, I suddenly realized that coaching, possibly, but it was certainly good management. Mm-hmm. It was very, very subtle the way they did it. And that, Tony Woodcock gave me another example with Clough, which I would go into if we had the time.
We certainly have got the time, sir.
Well, I'll give you Tony's. Tony basically said that Clough only ever said two things to him in his life that he felt could be deemed as relating to a bit of coaching, but not in the normal sense. And he said, I recall the first leg of the European Cup first round tie when they were drawn against Liverpool, the holders. Their first game in Europe, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
And they were playing at home, and Clough just pulled him to one side before the game, and he said, young man, I would just have it in your mind tonight just to play a little further right. He said, I'm not talking about playing on the right wing or this and the other. Just be conscious of moving a little further right occasionally. And Tony didn't really know what he was talking about. And he said, but if you look at that game, both of the goals that took us through to the next round came from my crosses from the right-hand side that Colin Barrett and another, can't remember, put into the goal. And he's right. And he said, I came off and I suddenly realised he'd been clever. And I didn't know, he never explained to me why he'd done it, why he'd said it, but he'd seen something and he hadn't made a big deal out of it. It just sort of coasted. In the same way as John McGovern said that, Clough signs Kenny Burns, your star striker. Yeah. And poor old Kenneth, as he used to be referred to, was told that he was playing at centre half. And McGovern says that Clough never once felt the need to explain to Kenneth why he was playing in this position. And 12 months later, he was the Football Writers Player of the Year, and that was justification enough. And it was, when people talk about a genius for man management, and they all had it, all three of them had it. It was that ability to say the right thing at the right time without overcoaching people, with keeping things simple.
He was just an absolute genius. I remember Terry Curran telling me that when he bought Terry into to Forest, I think they won they'd won a League Cup game 5-0. I can't remember who it was against or where it was, but he took Terry Curran down. He says to Martin O'Neill, "Young man, he's taking your place in the team." And Clough would do stuff like that. He'd say to Martin O'Neill said to him, didn't he, "Why am I in the reserves? Because we haven't got a third team." and he was just a genius. Kenny Burns watching the other one that Johnny Owen done about Nottingham Forest, about the winning the championship and then the European Cup. And Kenny Burns, they were on about training, and he said, "We get a free kick it. Just kick it at the
Yeah,
goals. What we're going to
yeah,
do if we get indirect free kick? Well, pass it and kick it."
yeah.
and these were just basic, simple stuff that
No, absolutely.
Clough would do, and the players just
Well, it was
players,
done. It was done for a reason,
yeah,
Paul.
yeah,
It all seemed like a bit of fun and on the hoof, but it was done for a reason.
mm,
I remember Stuart Pearce on Talksport. I heard an interview whilst I was writing the book where he talked about the fact that Clough would always try and do the diametric opposite to what people were expecting because he wanted
yeah,
them on his toes. But this idea that all he was a guy putting fear into his players is totally wrong. And Clough himself said, Martin O'Neill might disagree with him, but Clough himself said, "I never wanted a player to go out on the pitch feeling fear because I'm not going to get the best out of them."
mm,
But there's a piece that I refer to in one of the chapters where Martin himself tells the story, I think in the book that he wrote last year, where he says that he'd been playing for Browne for 5 years. He'd missed the 1979 European Cup final, which had really hurt him.
yes,
He played in the 1980 final, and I can't remember the exact circumstances, but Forest were struggling a bit tactically in half time in that game, and Martin O'Neill sat in the dressing room and basically offered to sacrifice himself and say, "Boss, if you need so and so to come on, and Clough turned around to him and said something along the lines of, "You're not coming off, you're playing out of your skin." And Martin O'Neill said, "I'd waited 5 years for that line. I played for this guy for 5 years,
yeah,
and it's the first time he'd given me a bit of praise. And I went back out onto that field, absolutely electric." And that's how they did it. When people talk about a degree in people,
mm,
they knew the right thing to say to the right person at the right time. And it was a bit like Ferguson with having slightly different rules for Cantona to his class of '92. He realised that you have to have different strokes for different folks, and these three managers would do that, not to the point of. I mean, John McGovern did say he would say that Clough wouldn't change based on your personality. You had to change for Browne.
yeah,
Browne never changed for anybody. But there was a subtlety for the way that Browne would. Piercy was saying in his interview, if you'd gone away with England, you could be damn sure that when you got back, he'd do something that would pull you down a peg or two in front of the dressing room.
yeah,
But if the crowd were having a go at you and he rated you, then he would jump out and tell the crowd to shut up and say, "I believe in this lad, get behind him." And players, the word that I heard more often than any other from the players of all three clubs I talked to was togetherness
yeah,
and an esprit de corps that they built. And that moved mountains. That was the thing that more than anything else allowed them to achieve more than the sum of their parts. And that was all down to these three managers and the way they managed. And to be honest, again, at the end, when I talk about legacy, I talk about precious memories, but I also talk about timeless lessons, because it shouldn't be forgotten that these guys have left a blueprint that a lot of people are following these days. And Ferguson refers to Bobby Robson. So does Pep Guardiola. So does Jose Mourinho. They all reference Sir Bobby as being a guy that they learnt so much from. And the blueprint that they laid down in terms of the simplicity, the ability to release the pressure on their players, to believe in them, to give them trust, to give them honesty, to play in a simple, entertaining fashion. That's not just being portrayed by Pep Guardiola at Manchester City now. For God's sake, it's being portrayed by Ben Stokes as the captain of the England cricket team.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science, but people sometimes overcomplicate it.
Football is a simple game, and you're right. Sadly, some people do try and overcomplicate it. Back in the 70s, they didn't. They simplified it, and players knew what they got to do. I remember Alan telling me, Tony Waddington said, I'll never tell you how to play football. I bought you because I know you can play football. And that seems to be the message from so many former players that I've had the pleasure to interview and work with. And the managers, I think those managers of the 70s were absolute genius. And you talking about Bobby Robson and his lieutenants, Tony Barton done pretty
Yeah,
much the same
yeah.
with Ron Saunders. Every player that played for Villa in the league and won the league and the European Cup was brought into the club by Tony Barton. Ron Saunders didn't even see Andy Gray play football. You know, it was Tony Barton. He bought all them players in. So you're absolutely spot on. Where you've got that genius of a manager, he's got his people around him, whether that be Shankly in the boot room or managers that had one or two with them, but they were a team all working on the same page with maybe 16, no more than 18 in the squad, and pretty much the same 11 was playing every week.
Well, that's a very relevant point to how these teams evolved.
Yeah.
That Ipswich in particular, John Walker and Russell Osman would say, look, we all grew up through the youth team together.
Yeah.
And there's a chapter in the book, Turning the Tide, where all three managers and all three players of those clubs reference some of those quaint old anachronisms called the Texaco Cup and the Anglo-Scottish Cup. And the fact that Ipswich won the Texaco in 73, and Forest in 76 won the Anglo-Scottish, and in 74 Saints got the final of the Texaco. They said, all the players said, people poo-poo that stuff. That was really critical to our development. And Russell Osman would say that by the time we got to the first team, we'd all grown up together. And we had a guy like Eric Gates who was playing in a role that nobody was playing at the time. I hate to say it, but it's what probably they would now call a false nine.
Yeah, in the
nobody was playing it at the time, and nobody knew what to do with him. But they all knew what he was doing. It was telepathic because they'd been playing with him since they were about 15 years old. And that's the way Bobby built it through his youth system. And yet there's a slight distinction there that Bobby relied slightly more on the youth system. Lawrie was incredibly proud of a legacy that he left to Southampton. He loved a fantastic youth system there. But Lawrie was more about bringing in the odd Stardust name like an Osgood or a Keegan to really lift the club and the players around him. Whereas Clough, I think what Clough was brilliant at was taking what he had, what he saw in front of him, and polishing it and making it brilliant where nobody else could see the talent, with the most obvious example of all time being John Robson. They all did it slightly differently, but they all built this spirit to the point where I remember Steve Williams saying to me when I talked to him about it, he said, people talk about how they managed the dressing room, and it would have been absolute anathema to any one of those managers, like Fergie after them. This talk of the managers lost the dressing room. Well, they would not be having any of that. But Steve Williams said that the way that Lawrie did it was he brought in the Osgars and those sorts of guys, and the dressing room ran itself.
Yep.
You know,
100%.
they didn't need to be in there cracking the whip, because whatever Ozzy and Mick and Brian and Neil and co might get up to, um, they if as a young player coming through, and Steve was perfectly self-aware enough to say, look, I was a bit of a cockney coming through, and you would just get pulled to one side long before the manager got to you, and you get pulled into order. And he would say, if you're in a dressing room with Ted McDougall, Peter Osgood, Mick Shannon, these guys, and Jim McCalliog, first of all, you're not going to step out of line. But secondly, if you don't learn from those people, you're an idiot. And that's how Lawrie did it. He would bring in, but they weren't, when we talk about rascals and villains, he loved his rascals, the Aussies of this world, but they weren't what he would term villains. So there weren't terrorists in the dressing room. And what people don't realise, with the reputation Ozzy had for a good time and that sort of thing, everyone I talked to talked about Ozzy being an absolute diamond in the dressing room.
Yep.
Who grew the club, grew the team. The team wouldn't have had the confidence to win the FA Cup with Ozzy in that dressing room. But what they did was they spent a lot of time doing their duties for these players. And if anyone was what they called a villain or a shyster or a terrorist, they wouldn't have them anywhere near the dressing room. But some of those guys, and you clearly know Alan Hudson very well, they're not always exactly what their reputation suggests that they are. And Ozzy was an absolute diamond.
Absolutely. It has been a wonderful chat.
Yes, I enjoyed
Education.
it. I could go on
Education.
another 2 hours, but
We certainly could.
fortunately for everybody else, we don't have the time. But
It's published by Pitch Publishing. It's out now, and I'm guessing it's another fantastic cover designed by Duncan.
very possibly, yes. It is actually the chap at Pitch. We had a couple of conversations about it, because I wanted to make sure that the pictures on the front were definitely of the era. I didn't want a picture of Clough from Derby days or something like that. But Pitch have been absolutely fantastic with it. Can't speak highly enough. Cover's beautiful. And I still have a little bit of an imposter syndrome as an author, but when you're writing up something that's so dear to your heart, and as you can tell, we're both in the nerd end of the spectrum when it comes to football, I think, Paul, then it was a pleasure rather than a job of work to put the book together. And I just hope that other people get as much enjoyment out of it as I did putting it together.
Absolutely. And the easiest way that you can buy the book is either through Pitch or just go to Amazon. That's usually where I buy my books from.
Well, there's Pitch, there's Amazon, and extremely gratifyingly for myself, we seem to be nationwide in Waterstones and one or two other places at the moment. So there's no excuse, Paul. There's no excuse for anybody to say they couldn't find it.
Fantastic. And how can finally people link up with Ben Dobson? Facebook, Twitter, or X these days, Instagram? What's the easiest way that people can link up with you and say, Ben, I bought your book. What a great read. I've then gone on and bought Chasing Rainbows, another fantastic read. What's your next book and when's it out? So how can people do that?
Yeah, I'm on those various channels at Ben Dobson 67. You'll find me if you type anything to do with Ben Dobson and 67 into a LinkedIn, an Instagram, a Facebook, a Twitter. There you will find me. And actually, to be honest, Paul, one of the most gratifying things about doing book one was that it does link you up with these people who you weren't expecting to have made a connection. They've been nice about the book. Funnily enough, one of the guys who completely unsolicited put a very nice review on Amazon for your book one, managed to get in touch with him through social media. He's become a friend, and he has now been one of the interviewees and the contributors as a lifelong Ipswich fan to book two. So these things are, I love building those connections.
Absolutely. And guys, that's what social media is all about. It's social, it's connecting, and it's sharing the love of what we all love, football or sport. Fantastic.
Perfect.
Can I thank you so much for your time, Ben? All the very best for the future.
I hope there wasn't too much football diarrhea, but I think when we both get going on football, we share that passion and that nostalgia, don't we? So hopefully it'll work out as a podcast.
Absolutely. Those were the days, my friend.
All the best. We should stay in touch.
Cheers, pal. Definitely will.
Cheers.
Thanks, Ben,
Okay.
and thanks
All the
for
best.
listening, guys. Thank
No
you.
bother.
Bye for now. Bye.